They whispered it first among battalions in officers' messes and guarded letters home. Long before the Allied bombs fell upon Dresden, and years before Hitler's pistol echoed in the bunker beneath Berlin, some of Germany's most capable generals already knew. The war could not be won. It did not happen in one moment of revelation. The realization crept in slowly, first as unease, then as doubt, and finally as grim certainty. The men who had once basked in the aura of invincibility began to glimpse the abyss behind their triumphs. They would still obey, still command, still fight, but they would do so knowing that the end was written long before the curtain fell. In the early summer of 1941, the Wehrmacht stood at its zenith. In less than 2 years, the armies of Hitler's Germany had conquered Poland, Norway, France, the Low Countries, and much of the Balkans. The generals who had spent the interwar years nursing resentment and constraint now felt vindicated. Their doctrines had worked. The world trembled before their precision and speed. When Operation Barbarossa began on June 22nd, they believed they were witnessing the culmination of German military genius. Columns of panzers roared across the endless plains of the Soviet Union. Field Marshal Fedor von Bach's Army Group Center advanced hundreds of kilometers within weeks. Prisoners flooded in by the hundreds of thousands. By autumn, many officers thought the war would soon end in triumph. Hitler's prophecy of destroying Bohlism in a single campaign seemed plausible, but beneath the confidence ran a quieter unease. Some officers, veterans of the First World War, recognized a dangerous familiarity. The front was too wide, the logistics too fragile, the supply lines too long. Heinz-Guderian spearheads raced far ahead of their supply convoys. Motorized divisions were immobilized for lack of fuel. Infantry followed days behind. Yet Berlin demanded further advances ever deeper into Russia's vast interior. By November 1941, as the first snow fell on exhausted troops, that unease hardened into dread. The Soviet Union had not collapsed. New divisions appeared from the east. The Red Army, bloodied but unbroken, counter-attacked outside Moscow. Temperatures plunged below freezing, equipment failed, and the invincible Wehrmacht stalled for the first time. That winter in field headquarters and forward dugouts, the first fatal doubts began to take root. Officers who had believed in a short, decisive war now faced the same grinding attrition they had once sworn to avoid. Logistics were crippled, reserves depleted, morale brittle. Some whispered that the war was already unwinnable. Others pushed such thoughts away. But no one who survived the winter campaign of 1941 could mistake the truth. Germany was not fighting a campaign. It was mired in a war of exhaustion against a foe it had underestimated in every conceivable way. In 1942, Hitler demanded renewed offensives to restore momentum. The generals obeyed, but their confidence was hollow. The Wehrmacht launched Case Blue, its drive toward the oil fields of the Caucasus and the Volga. The plan, bold but reckless, divided the army's strength across immense distances. Field Marshal von Bach protested, warning that splitting forces between Stalingrad and the Caucasus risked catastrophe. Hitler dismissed him. "You always see black clouds," he snapped. Boch was relieved of command. As the panzers rolled southward, many officers knew the campaign's logic was fatally flawed. The distances were vast, the supply lines overstretched, and the Red Army, contrary to Hitler's delusions, was learning. By autumn, German forces were bogged down in street fighting in Stalingrad. Reports from the front painted a desperate picture. The Soviets had no intention of yielding. When the encirclement came in November, it stunned Berlin, but not the officers who had seen the warning signs. For the first time, an entire German field army was surrounded and doomed. Inside the frozen city, General Friedrich Paues maintained radio contact with Hitler, pleading for permission to attempt a breakout. None came. The Sixth Army perished where it stood. The psychological effect was devastating. Stalingrad shattered the myth of invincibility. Officers who had once scoffed at defeat now faced it in its purest form. The unspoken question spread like a contagion. If this could happen to the finest army Germany had ever fielded, what hope remained? The spring of 1943 brought no real recovery, only the illusion of one. The Wehrmacht prepared a massive counter-offensive at Kursk, intended to restore the balance on the Eastern Front. Many generals privately doubted the plan. Intelligence reports suggested the Soviets were heavily fortified. The element of surprise was gone. Yet Hitler insisted on attacking. Kursk was the last great German gamble of the war, and its failure sealed the strategic outcome. The Red Army's defenses held firm, German armor was decimated. When the offensive collapsed, there would be no more major victories. The generals now fought a retreating war. They could not win. After Kursk, even the most loyal officers began to sense the inevitable. Hitler still ranted about miracle weapons and the indomitable will of the German soldier. But the men who commanded those soldiers could read the maps. They saw the Red Army advancing inexorably westward, and they knew the Allies would soon strike in the west. For the first time, many realized that the war would not end with victory or negotiation. It would end with destruction. By the end of 1943, the mood inside the officer corps had changed entirely. The arrogance of 1940 had given way to quiet fatalism. German industry could no longer replace losses. Allied bombers ruled the skies. The U-boat fleet was being annihilated in the Atlantic. Generals who had once preached blind loyalty to Hitler began to talk in cautious tones about saving what could be saved. Some officers began to contemplate the unthinkable, removing Hitler himself. The idea had surfaced before during moments of crisis, but now it found adherents even among high-ranking staff officers. Men like Klaus von Stauffenberg, Henning von Tesco, and Ludwig Beck were not merely idealists disgusted by Nazi crimes. They were professional soldiers who had concluded that Hitler was leading Germany to annihilation. To kill him, they reasoned, was not treason. It was salvation. Yet such thoughts remained treacherous. The Gestapo was everywhere. Dissent, even in private, could mean death. For most, it was easier to remain silent, to tell themselves that perhaps the tide might yet turn. Some placed hope in new weapons, others in a rift between the Western Allies and the Soviets. But beneath every rationalization lay the same buried truth. The war was lost. In 1944, that truth became undeniable. On June 6th, Allied armies stormed the beaches of Normandy. Within days, it was clear that the Western Front could not be held indefinitely. German forces were overstretched, short of fuel, and hampered by Hitler's micromanagement. The generals who had once prided themselves on maneuver warfare were now reduced to executing suicidal orders dictated from a map room hundreds of kilometers away. Field Marshal Owen Rommel, commanding Army Group B, saw the situation clearly. Touring the front lines, he confided to his staff that the war was hopeless. "The enemy's material superiority is overwhelming," he said. "Every day we prolong this war is a crime." RML quietly urged Hitler to negotiate a peace with the Western Allies, but Hitler's response was fury. When the July 20th plot to assassinate him failed, Rommel was implicated. Faced with the choice between trial and death, he chose the latter. Other generals met similar fates. Gunther von Kluge, commanding in the West, also came under suspicion after the failed plot. Summoned to Berlin, he swallowed poison en route. Many others were executed outright. The officer corps was decimated by its own despair. The failure of the July plot had a chilling effect. Whatever illusions of internal reform or military salvation remained were extinguished. The surviving generals understood that the regime would destroy itself, and them with it. Still, they continued to fight, partly out of duty, partly out of fear. By early 1945, Germany was collapsing on all fronts. The Red Army was advancing through East Prussia and Silesia. The Western Allies were crossing the Rhine. The country lay in ruins, and yet Hitler continued to issue impossible orders. Cities were to be held to the last man. Armies that no longer existed were to counterattack. Civilians were to be conscripted into a Volkerm. Many generals no longer obeyed. They falsified reports, ignored orders, or quietly surrendered their commands. Others clung to the fantasy that the Western Allies might turn against the Soviets and join Germany in a final anti-Bolshevik crusade. But such hopes were delusions born of desperation. In April, as the Soviets closed in on Berlin, the last vestiges of discipline disintegrated. Hitler raged at his generals, accusing them of betrayal and cowardice. Yet even he could no longer deny what they had known for years. On April 22nd, during a meeting in the Führer bunker, he broke down completely, admitting that the war was lost and that suicide was his only escape. For the generals, the moment carried no relief. They had lived through the disintegration of everything they once believed in: honor, discipline, and the myth of German superiority. Some, like General Walterbank, tried to rescue civilians fleeing the Soviets. Others simply waited for capture. A few, like Wilhelm Kittler and Alfred Udell, remained loyal to the end, signing the unconditional surrender that marked the final humiliation of the regime they had once served so faithfully. Looking back, one might wonder how men so intelligent, so seasoned, could have deluded themselves for so long. The answer lies partly in ideology, partly in pride, and partly in fear. Many of Hitler's generals shared his contempt for democracy and his hatred of communism. They believed that whatever his flaws, Hitler had restored Germany's honor and rebuilt its army. To admit defeat was to admit that everything they had fought for since 1933, and indeed since 1918, had been a lie. Others were trapped by circumstance. The Wehrmacht was not a monolith. It was a vast institution bound by loyalty, habit, and hierarchy. To rebel against Hitler was to betray not just a leader, but an entire system of obedience that defined a soldier's identity. When the first hints of defeat appeared, most officers chose denial over defiance. When defeat became certain, they lacked the moral courage to act upon it. Yet there were exceptions. Men like Stauffenberg, Beck, and Tresckow, who risked everything to end the madness. Their failure sealed Germany's fate. After July 1944, the war became an exercise in futility. A slow-motion collapse carried forward by inertia and terror. Millions more would die before the inevitable surrender. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the reckoning began. In Allied interrogation rooms and post-war memoirs, the generals spoke freely at last. They blamed Hitler, the SS, the party, anyone but themselves. They claimed they had seen the disaster coming and tried to avert it. Some even portrayed themselves as victims of a mad dictator they could not control. There was truth in some of these claims, but also evasion. Many of those who later insisted they knew it was lost had continued to obey orders that prolonged the slaughter. They had rationalized their complicity as duty. The tragedy of Germany's generals was not merely that they recognized defeat too late. It was that even when they did, they lacked the will to stop it. From the frozen steppes of Russia to the rubble of Berlin, the evidence of failure was plain. By 1943, the war was strategically lost. By 1944, militarily hopeless. By 1945, morally bankrupt. But long before the final capitulation, in the quiet moments between battles, many of Hitler's generals had already surrendered in their hearts. They could see what he could not. That Germany's destiny was sealed not in the ruins of Berlin, but in the arrogance of 1941, when they mistook lightning war for omnipotence and mistook conquest for invulnerability. The tragedy of the Wehrmacht was that it kept fighting long after it knew it was beaten, and in doing so, it ensured that defeat would not only destroy Hitler, but the nation he had promised to make eternal. That is how defeat truly unfolded, not in a single climactic moment, but as a creeping awareness that spread through the very men who had once believed they commanded destiny itself. When Hitler's generals realized they had lost, There was no announcement, no proclamation, only silence, disbelief, and the slow, inevitable disintegration of faith. They had gambled everything on victory. When it failed them, there was nothing left to believe.